Hey, how's it going? Welcome back. We are welcoming you back to another Developer Office Hour. Today we're going to do saving and reusing cards with SCA. I see a few folks in chat. Good morning. I guess it's a good morning here in Reno, but likely around the world you're joining us for these Developer Office Hours for SCA, particularly because they're for folks that are in the EEA. So today we're going to do a live episode that centers around making one-time payments. That we're going to do around saving and reusing cards that are using the new SCA Ready Setup Intent API. I'm going to jump in here. As folks join us, they will be able to go back and rewatch the beginning of this episode, but we've got a pretty action-packed setup for you today in this hour. So we want to jump in and get started. So obviously with the quickly approaching deadline for SCA of September 14th, we want to just jump in and help you integrate and store some card details to be charged later. So again, welcome back. I'm CJ, a developer support engineer, and today I'm joined by Sophie, another expert in SCA, today from our business operations team here at Stripe. As a reminder, we have a team of knowledgeable Stripes standing by to answer your questions live in chat today. So go ahead and ask away. Welcome Dina Trium and Danilo Grecchio, Heath, folks that are in the chat, welcome all, and hopefully you find this useful. So today's agenda, we're going to talk about a quick overview of what SCA is, and then we're going to do a live coding walkthrough, and then at the end we'll save time for Q&A. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Sophie, who's going to tell us some more about SCA.
Hi, I'm Sophie, and I work on helping Stripes users prepare for SCA. Before we dive into the specifics of off-session payments that CJ is going to present, I wanted to give you a quick recap of Sca Regulation and how the new requirements may impact your business. So I'll begin with a quick overview of what SCA is and who is affected by it. The first thing to know is what types of payments are impacted by SCA. SCA applies to customer-initiated online card payments. Next, what businesses are impacted by SCA. Businesses based in the European Economic Area, or EEA, accepting payments from customers also based in the EEA are in scope for this regulation. You may see transactions between these two parties referred to as two-leg transactions. When do SCA rules take effect? We expect customer banks to start enforcing SCA on September 14th. And finally, what authentication methods are used to comply with SCA? 3D Secure is by far the most common method for card payments. The good news is that not all payments in Europe are subject to these requirements. There are a number of exemptions. CJ, can you please go to the next? Oh, perfect. All right. So there are specific transaction types for which you'll be able to request exemptions. There are also some types of payments that will be outside the scope of SCA. Although being out of scope is legally different from being an exemption, in practice, we need to request it just like any other exemption, which should interest most of you because of the topic of these office hours are off-session payments. Off-session payments are payments processed while the customer is not currently using your application or website. Some common examples are subscription billing or unscheduled payments after the fact, like no-show fees. We designed our APIs to make sure we can support the widest set of exemptions for our users and make exemption claiming and optimization as easy as possible. It's important to note that when we request an exemption, it's the customer's bank who will decide whether or not to accept the exemption or require authentication. It's in a bank's interest to provide a smoother checkout experience for its cardholders, but it is important to remember that exemptions can still fail. Now I'll hand it back over to CJ to walk you through how to build an SCA-ready integration that can handle off-session card payments. Awesome.
Thanks, Sophie. It's always helpful to kind of recenter ourselves and talk about what SCA is and why we need it. With this new regulation, we now have this extra step that we may or may not need to do when taking payments online. So today we're going to go through how you might safeguard card details and authenticate and then charge them later. So today we're going to use PHP with the Slim web framework to demonstrate how to save card details and charge them later. We're going to be using the Stripe API version 2019 August 14. You can find your Stripe API version under the dashboard if you go to /developers. If you're watching this later, you'll find the code for this episode and other previous episodes on GitHub in our Stripe samples organization. Again, this episode centering on an SCA-ready way to save the payment details without taking a payment up front and then charging later. Check out the Stripe developer playlists for other SCA examples and code walkthroughs. We're going to have examples in other languages, so Ruby, Python. We'll also have samples for other payment flows like billing. So with that, let's jump in to some code. And before we get too far, I wanted to just make a quick distinction between payment intents and setup intents. So in the previous episode, we did a one-time payment walkthrough where we collected payment using the payment intents API. Today, we're going to be using the setup intent API. And the main difference in the way that you can think of it is that a payment intent moves money. So a payment intent is an intent to collect money. A setup intent is purely for the authentication of those card details. So that is just getting permission to charge the card later. So a payment intent sort of wraps both of those things up and allows you to take one-time payments. A setup intent is the separate abstraction that is purely for authenticating the payment. So we're really going to start from scratch again here. So I'm going to create another directory called reuse cards. And going to start with just some blank files. Okay. This is what the directory structure looks like. So we have a simple client. We have a server that has the language and the server file back here. This is kind of the same structure that we use for all of our demos. And this is going to have 3 steps to it. So 3 separate pages for the demonstration. So step 1, we're going to have a page where we can save the customer's card. Step 2, we're going to have a way that you can charge the card later. So this step 2, you might actually implement this on your server in some cron job or some process that's going to run in the background to collect money. The way that we're going to demonstrate it is through having an admin interface where you would theoretically have folks go and charge customers later. And then finally, step 3 is something that I really wanted to demo, and that is how you might bring customers back on session if for some reason the off-session payment failed because it needed authentication. So this is a case that we really need to work with and consider. And so we added this step 3 to just show you how that might work to bring the customer back on session to authenticate a payment that failed off-session. Let's go ahead and get started. So I'm going to require some dependencies here for our backend. And while that's loading, I just wanted to say again, welcome to folks that are here in the chat. Again, we have tons of knowledgeable Stripe standing by to answer your questions. So if you have SCA related questions, do ask away. We're really excited to see folks on here from Spain, New York, Italy, Berlin. So yeah, it's really exciting to have all of you here with us, and we're excited to answer your questions live. Okay, so I've required some dependencies here. We're going to use Stripe PHP. Obviously, the Slim 3.2 web framework requires a little bit less boilerplate and is a little faster to get going. And then again, this php.env library that helps us manage environment variables. That's just going to be for, just for managing environment variables. All right. So before we get too far, I want to set a couple of things up. So in Composer here, I'm going to set up a script that we can run. And then, sorry, going to slow down a little bit. So I'm just adding a script here so that when we say start for Composer, we're going to run a local server on 4242 that's going to serve up this index.php file, which is going to hold all of our server code using the Slim web framework. Okay. In our index.php file, we're going to use .env to manage our environment variables. in the sample code that you'll find later, there is a .env.example file that you can check out that will have, the format of all the keys and where they belong, and the names so they work with the demo. When you pull down the demo repo, you'll want to go in and change these keys to be your own keys. Okay. The next thing we want to do is start up a Slim app. And when we get the root, we actually just want to serve up this step 1 save card. So I'm going to do that here. Step 1 save card HTML. And right now that's just a blank HTML file. So we're going to populate that now. Okay. Step 1 save card details. All right. Before we get too much further, we'll just start the server now that we have just really bare bones HTML file, just to make sure that we're able to load this thing. So if we go to localhost 4242 and refresh the page, we're getting just our basic empty HTML file here. Okay, so I wanted to walk through, again, the same way that we did with one-time payments and just show you how you can go through the guide and use the guide to implement saving card details without payment. So when you get to this page, you'll notice that there's 5 steps. We're going to create the setup intent, pass its client secret to the client, collect the payment method details, and then submit the card details to Stripe from the client. And then after that's all done, we're going to attach the payment method to the customer. This is actually pretty close to it's a very similar flow to what we used for making one-time payments, but this time we're not going to collect any payment. One thing I wanted to point out is that this is for saving card details without a payment. If you're in a situation where you're collecting payment up front and you want to reuse card details, then you'll want to check out this saving cards after a payment guide, which is very similar to the last episode that we did around one-time payments. The big difference being that when you create the payment intent in the beginning, you set the setup future usage to off session. So we're not going to go through that today, but you can check out the after a payment guide. This, again, is going to be saving card details without a payment. So we have these 5 steps, and I'm going to start by just making a comment here in the server about what steps we're going to take. So we're going to create a setup intent on the server, and then we're going to pass that client secret to the client, collect the payment details, and submit the details to Stripe. So the first step happens on the server, and then these next 3 steps happen on the client. So I'm going to put those there. Okay. All right. So step 1, create a setup intent on the server. All right. So the way that this works is we're going to create an API endpoint that will create a new setup intent and return just the raw JSON of that setup intent. So setup intents, and okay, we're just going to create a new setup intent and return the JSON for that intent. I want to test that out over here, so I'm just going to say curl localhost 4242 setup intents, just to make sure that we're getting back a setup intent. And I do see an ID there and some JSON for the setup intent, so I expect this to be working fine. Okay, and then let's go back to the guide quickly to make sure that we're staying on track. So we've done this first step, creating the setup intent on the server. One thing to note with this first step is that the default for a setup intent is for the usage to be off session. This means that when we create a setup intent and authenticate these payment details, we intend to use them off session when the customer is not on session with us. So what we're doing here is we're just relying on the default of creating the setup intent off session. Now, if you wanted to save card details and you know that your customer is going to be on session every time that you use the card details later, you could create a setup intent where the usage is on session. And this just means that when you go to create payment intents in the future, if the customer is on session, if necessary, they can go through that authentication flow with you on session. All right, step 2, pass the setup intents client secret to the client. Again, in the guide here, we're using some like templating language or server-side rendering to inject the client secret for the setup intent into the HTML. We're not going to use this templating. Instead, we're going to request the setup intent through the API and then use the setup intent that we're returning from the API. We're going to use the client secret from that setup intent, but we still do want this HTML. So that we have like a button and a card element, etc. So we're not going to use the setup intent, but we are going to use this cardholder name and the card input. Okay, just adding a value there so we don't have to type it every time. Okay, and then this card input is just going to sit on its own here. Oops. Okay. And we have this save card. And then one other thing that I'm going to add is for demonstration, I'm going to add this card message div that we can use to just like put messages so that we don't have to look directly in the console. And so I'm going to use a debug method so that we can see what's going on. This debug method is very simple. All it's doing is grabbing that card message div and then adding some text to it as we go through this process of setting things up. All right, so now we have some HTML. We're going to collect the cardholder name, and we're using this card element. So we now need to fetch the setup intent's client secret from the server. So the way that we can do that is say, let's say we're going to fetch the setup intent. And then we're just going to store this in a variable here for clarity and simplicity. Also log out the response and then say that we fetched it. Okay. All right, and so this actually completes step 2 of the guide. So now we have, we are collecting the client secret for the setup intent because that will be fetched from our API endpoint here, where we're creating a setup intent and returning all of the JSON for it. Okay, so let's go on. Well, I'll show you real quick. I'm going to jump over to the live screen and refresh the page so you can see what it looks like. So here, the first thing that's happening is we're fetching the setup intent. So this debug thing is just adding these messages at the bottom here. And then the fetched setup intent, this is the ID of the setup intent that we have fetched. And if we look at the setup intent that we got back, you'll notice that the status is requires payment method. So this is a setup intent that's ready to have a payment method attached to it and authenticated. Okay. All right. So this is what it looks like at this point. We're going to go on to step 3. Collect the payment method details on the client. So we're going to use Stripe elements here to mount that card element. And then we'll have something to work with. So collect card details. Collecting the payment method on the client, we also needed Stripe.js. Okay. So we're initializing a new Stripe object. We're initializing a collection of elements, we're creating a card element, and then we're mounting that to the card element input that we created earlier. So this is just going to set up Stripe elements so that we can collect payment details. At this point, we're just allowing the user to enter those payment details into the card element. So nothing really has changed. The card input will have, now it will be mounted. So you'll see like the placeholders for the card number, but not much has changed. So let's go ahead and jump to this next step here. Okay, submitting the card details to Stripe from the client. Okay, you can go back through and read the guide. But I'm going to move a little bit quickly here. I apologize for switching around screens if that's if it's moving a little quickly. we've got quite a bit to get through, so I just want to make sure that we have enough time here. Okay, I'll go through this line by line. So we have the cardholder name. This is the input, the reference to the input where we're going to enter the cardholder name. Then we're grabbing reference to the card button. And next in the guide, it's expecting again that the setup intents client secret was injected into that data attribute for the card button. But instead of using the client secret here, we're not relying on this templating, and we're not relying on the server injecting this into the HTML. So what we're doing instead is we're going to rely on that setup intent that we fetched earlier. Okay. Going down through this click handler. So when the card button is clicked, we're going to handle card setup. One thing I wanted to mention again is that you might want to prevent default here so that your click event doesn't bubble up to a form. So if this element is inside of a form, we don't want this click event to be submitting the form. So you can say prevent default. Then we're calling handle card setup, which is a method on the Stripe.js Stripe object. And we're passing in the setup intents client secret. So here, we're going to just use the client secret, again, that was returned to us from the API. Okay. The second argument here is the card element. So handle card setup is going to do a lot of heavy lifting for us in terms of authentication. So it takes in the client secret for that setup intent. It takes in reference to the card element, and then it combines, or it will tokenize the card element, the data that's in the card element, and will walk through the authentication flow if necessary. So this is the point at which the modal will open to walk you through the 3D secure authentication flow. You can also pass some additional data here if you want to check out what what other options are available. You can go check out the Stripe.js reference in the Stripe docs to see what other arguments you can pass as payment method data. And then finally, once the handle card setup has resolved, either the modal opened or the card didn't require authentication, that will return a promise that's resolved with an object called result that has either an error property or a setup intent property. So if it's an error, we want to debug and say result.error.message. Otherwise, we want to say, the setup succeeded. And we also want to see setup intent payment method is going to be, okay, so the setup intent, once it has been authenticated, will have this payment method property, and this is going to be some string PM underscore, and then some random string. That's the tokenized reference to these card details that have been authenticated. So this is really important, and this is what we're going to use in the future when we charge later and when we attach the payment method to the customer so that we can use it later. Also just going to console.log the result here so we have the full thing to look at if we'd like. And for fun, just saying that we're going to handle card setup. Okay. All right. So that's the click handler for our card button. Let's go back and refresh the page and play around with this a little bit. So if we enter a card number that we know does not require authentication, the trusty old 4242 card, and we click Save Card, we're going to say handling setup succeeded. Here's the payment method for that setup intent that has been authenticated and is ready to be charged later. Now you'll notice that no modal was opened, and that's because this card does not require 3D secure. It's not, doesn't fall under the SCA requirements. So if we refresh the page and try a different card, this is the 3155 card. When we're back on the guide, if you go to the very bottom of the guide, you'll see a bunch of test cards that you can use for these regulatory flows, and they'll allow you to trigger the SCA modal. So this is one of those cards. So if we click Save Card, handling card setup will open the modal. Then you have the opportunity to either complete your authentication or fail authentication. So if we complete, and then that gives us back a setup intent payment method. This payment method is referenced to an authenticated payment method that's ready to be attached to a customer and charged later. Cool. Looks like there's some really great questions in chat. Again, if you're watching this later, I'd really encourage you to subscribe to the channel so that you get notified of upcoming developer office hours and you can participate in the chat. Again, we have tons of knowledgeable Stripes in there answering questions. So thanks everyone who's joined, and also thanks everyone who's chipping in to share their SCA knowledge. All right, back to the guide. We scroll down, there's just one more step in this flow, and that is to attach the payment method to a customer after success. So we have authenticated this payment method and we've gotten permission from the customer to use it later, but it turns out that we can't actually create an off-session payment intent with this payment method unless it's attached to a customer. So what we're going to do now is attach this payment method to a customer. And the way that I'm going to do that is by creating a new endpoint, a new API endpoint that we can call on success of handle card setup. So after we have authenticated the card and gotten permission to charge it, then we'll make an API request to our backend to create a new customer with this payment method. Now, if you already have existing customers, one option is to retrieve that, the payment method that we just created, and then you can call attach and attach it to an existing customer. So I don't have any existing customers, so I'm going to create a new one. All right, so back over here. Okay, let's start with the backend. So the backend is going to be attach the payment method to the customer. Create customer. It's going to create customer endpoint that's going to return the JSON of the customer. And this is what it's going to look like. Okay, so, okay. We are setting up a new route that accepts post requests to the route /create customer. We're going to pull off some data from the body. That's namely just going to be this payment method. Again, this is going to be the string PM underscore whatever. We're going to do a little try catch block here just in case something fails when we're creating the customer. And on the client, we can handle that response the same way and with the same pattern that we would these other errors. Okay. Also of note, the exception hierarchy for Stripe PHP is being updated right now and overhauled so that it comes in line more with our other libraries. So if you are heading down the path of implementing a bunch of concrete exception handling, check out the Stripe PHP repo for updates on how version 7 of the Stripe PHP library will be handling exceptions and naming exceptions. Okay, so that's attaching the payment method to the customer after success. From the client, what we want to do is when we have successfully authenticated this payment, we're going to call a method that we're going to define, a function we're going to define here called create customer. We're going to pass in method. Okay, I'm not sure why my syntax highlighting is off. Okay, function create customer payment method. Okay, be a post request to create customer, and that will look like this: payment method, and then again, let's just say like creating customer. I like to put ellipses right before I make an AJAX request. If we get an error back, we'll log out the error. Otherwise, we're going to say created customer response.id. And we'll just console log whole response. I don't know why my syntax. Oh, okay. Did I miss a curly brace somewhere? Oh, there it goes. All right. Thank you, Vim. Okay, so now we're creating a customer, passing in the payment method. We have our create customer call where create customer, making a post request, passing in the payment method that we have just authenticated right? So this setup intent has authenticated this payment method. So this is PM underscore some random string, passing that in to create customer. We're going to call our backend to create a customer. If we succeed, we're going to log out that we created the customer and the customer's ID. So if there was an error, we're going to log out the error. Okay. All right. So I think that looks good. So I'm going to switch back over to the browser and show you how that might look in practice here. Refresh. Again, card without authentication, click save. Handling card setup. We created the payment method. Now we created the customer. At this point, we are done saving card details for later. Okay, we have permission to charge this card later. We have attached this payment method to this customer. If you wanted to check and see if the payment method was attached to the customer, one thing you can do with Stripe CLI is you can say Stripe get payment methods and pass in the customer and the type. And you'll see the list of payment methods that have been attached to that customer. So Jenny Rosen has this payment method attached to them. Okay. All right. Back to the browser. All right, so the next step here is that we want to create a way to charge the customer later. So we're going to build an admin interface where you pass in the string for the payment method and the string for the customer. Obviously, in your own system, you would store reference to these IDs. You want to store reference to the customer and store reference to the payment method so that you can charge these later. Yeah, one thing to highlight is that customer, when you're in the old world, you could assign a source as the default source for a customer, and then you could just use the customer when you're creating charges. Moving forward with payment methods, the API expects that you pass in the payment method explicitly. So for every off-session payment, we're going to want to send in both the payment method ID that we want to charge and the customer. Okay, so moving on to our admin view. So right now, there is no page. So let's go to our, so we'll start off by just creating a brand new HTML page here. This is going to be step 2, charge later. Okay. And there is within the guide, we show you how you can create a payment intent off session, but there is no walkthrough about how to create an interface for this, because we expect that most folks will generally do this charging later as part of a background task or as part of fulfilling some other order process. So this interface is going to be not something that's in the guide, but I just wanted to show you how this might work. Okay, so we're going to pass in the customer input. We're also going to have a payment method here. Payment method input, and then finally just a button, charge customer. And again, card message, or just like little debug window at the bottom. Card message. Okay. So very simple HTML page, just takes the customer input and the payment method input. And then when we click on this charge customer button, it'll make a request to the backend with the customer ID and the payment method ID. We'll create a payment intent, and then we'll show some details of that on the client. Okay, so while we're here, I'm going to grab reference to the customer and the payment method. And the card button. And what we're going to do is we're going to say when the card button is clicked, we're going to make a request to our backend on a new route called payment intents that we haven't created yet, but we'll go create that. And this is going to pass the payment method and the customer. Okay. Console.log the response. If response.error, and we want to log out the error message. Otherwise, we're going to say customer charged. Okay. All right, so later on, we're going to want to handle off session payment failures here. Okay. So we'll come back and do this after we have our backend set up for creating payment intents. Creating payment intent. Okay. All right, so when we click that card button again, we're going to create a post request to our backend with the payment in to create a payment intent. We're going to pass the payment method and the customer. All right, so very simple. All right, let's go back to the backend to create a payment. Well, we need a couple of things. First, we need a route that renders this admin page. So I'm just going to call it /admin. And the HTML file is going to be step 2. All right. Okay. And then the second thing we need is an endpoint for creating payment intents. And it's going to look like this. I'm actually going to grab this from the guide to show you some more information about the payment intent that we're going to create. So from the guide, we just completed saving card without payment. Now we're moving on to charging saved cards. So if we click on charging saved cards, there's actually 2 guides here, one for charging on session and one for charging off session. So this is going to be the example for charging off session. So on session payments with saved cards, again, you create a payment intent, pass it to the client, and then if the client is there, they can walk through the authentication flow to complete the payment. For us, in this case, what we want to do is create off-session payments with these saved cards. So the first thing we want to do is create this payment intent with the payment method. Again, this entry point in this step 1 might happen as part of a background task or as part of some other commands that you're running. And so the way that we're going to solve this is by adding this admin interface where you can pass the customer and payment method. So we'll grab that. And then I also, while we're here, I wanted to just talk briefly about step 2 and 3 because there isn't really much code in the guide, but we're going to implement these. So step 2 is to check the intent status, the payment intent status. If it succeeded, we know that the payment intent went through and we were able to collect money from the customer. If the payment intent fails because it requires authentication, then this means that we need to bring the customer back on session to have them authenticate. Now, when they come back on session, we might do 2 things. We might either have them re-authenticate or authenticate that payment intent that we created, or allow them to enter new payment details that they can attach to that payment intent to complete the payment. So today we're going to show how you would bring them back on session to just complete the authentication for that payment intent that was already created. So again, we're going to start with this payment intent here. All right. Okay. So walking through the payment intent, we have an amount and a currency. So this amount that you're charging, this might be another thing that you can pass in from an admin interface or from some process. This customer ID is something we want to replace with params customer. We're going to pass that in. And then the payment method is going to be params payment method. And then these final 2 pieces are very important. So off session true, this means that we want to complete this payment intent. Off session, we expect that we have already authenticated this card and that we have permission to charge. So we want to set off session to true. We also want to confirm true. This is going to do the confirmation step saying, yes, we have permission. Yes, the user does want us to make this charge. Okay. And then finally, yeah, just error handling and returning. Okay. I think we're at a point where we can go ahead and give this a try. So I'm going to jump back to the browser, refresh the page, and see if this works. Okay. All right, so again, we're in our admin interface, admin up here. We have a customer and a payment method input. So let's grab the customer and payment method from the previous step. It's the customer, it's the payment method, and we're going to click charge customer. So we're creating the payment intent that was passed to our backend, and the customer was charged. So that is looking good. Okay, that's looking great. Now, what I'm going to do is use a test card that requires authentication. So let's see what happens when we have an SCA test card. So we're going to open the modal, we complete the authentication, and we say, yes, we do give permission to charge this card. So now we have a payment method that we want to use, and we have a customer that we want to use. Charge the customer, creating the payment intent, customer was charged. Okay, so those are all working great. We've gotten permission to charge the card both ways. So first we showed that there was a card with no authentication required. Then we showed a card that had authentication required. Finally, what I want to do is show you a card where every single transaction requires authentication. This is a test card, but it's also a use case that we really need to cover, because while we are able to request exemptions for charging off session, there are certain scenarios where even if you have permission to charge a card, and even if you have charged the card before, charging off session might trigger a requirement for authentication. So this is how we can test that, is with this 3184 card. So we have our setup intent. We're going to say save the card, handle setup. We successfully complete authentication. So we say, yes, I give permission to charge this card. We grab the payment method, bring it back over here, grab the payment method and the customer that we want to charge. We're dumping them in here. And then we're going to click charge customer. It's going to create the payment intent and say your card was declined because this transaction requires authentication. All right, so the test card 3184, that test card requires authentication again for every single transaction. So this transaction failed because it requires authentication. This is a case that we need to consider and to take into, it's one of those things we need to build for, okay? So in this scenario, what we want to do is bring the customer back on session. So I'm going to show you how to do that. Ideally, you have some ID that's referring to an order or to some product that's being purchased, so that you can point the customer directly to a page and you can bring them back and have them re-authenticate or enter card details. Because I'm not storing anything in the database, we're going to make this really simple. And what I'm going to do is build a URL that we can send the customer to that will allow them to complete their authentication. Okay, so on this page, when authentication fails for requires authentication, or when processing the payment fails for requires authentication, I'm just going to log out to the screen a URL that we can copy and paste that will allow us to send to the customer, and they can click on the link and complete their authentication. Okay. So this is going to be step 3. So we're going to add another route here for step 3. Step 3 complete. Okay. And yeah. So one other thing that we're going to want with step 3 for completing this authentication is that when we bring the user back on session, we want to tell them why their card failed. So one thing that we're going to do is that URL is going to have the payment intent ID and the payment method ID embedded in the query params. And when the page loads, I want to make sure we can fetch the payment intent and look at the error that was related to that payment intent and show that to the customer. So I'm just going to make another route here called payment intents. That is a GET request, different from the one above for a POST request. And it's just going to be retrieving payment intent using the ID that we're going to pass in. Okay. So very simple, again, payment intent example here. Or endpoint. So we're just returning, when we make a GET request, we're going to return those payment intents. Okay. So the HTML for this complete page, again, this is going to be something we're sending to the customer. So we'll put our logo on there. And this is step 3, authenticate. And this is going to have, we want a div to show them the card error. We'll keep that. We also want a button for them to authenticate. And finally, our trusty little card message debug div that we can use here. Okay. All right. So the steps involved in authentication or re-authenticating this payment intent. First, we want to fetch payment intent so that we can show the error. Next, we want to add a click handler to start the handle card payment process. Okay. All right, so these are the two things that we want to do. So we're going to grab reference to the card error. Grab reference to the card button. And, oh, right. Okay, so the other thing that we want to do is we're going to use the payment intent and payment method params from the URL. So those are going to be embedded in the URL. Okay, I'm going to say var payment intent ID is params.get. I'll just shorten it to PI. And payment method ID PM. Okay, so we're going to pass both of these things in the URL. We're going to say we're fetching payment intent. Hit the new endpoint that we just created. Log out the response. Okay, so that response is going to be the payment intent object. If the payment intent has a last payment error, okay, so the last payment error is a property of payment intent. If it has a last payment error, we want to use that as our card error message. So we're going to say card error.inner text is the message from that last payment error. Right, okay. And the other thing we want to do is we want to store reference to the payment intent. Not just the ID, but the whole payment intent, because we need the client secret from the payment intent that we're fetching to go through that handle card payment process. Okay, we're storing that payment intent again on the response, or that is the response that we're getting back from our server when we hit the fetch payment intents API. Okay, next we want to add a click handler for this card button. So card button, when the card button is clicked, we want to call handle card payment. We're going to pass in the payment intent client secret and some data. The data here is going to be just the payment method that we have already authenticated initially, and that we want to have the user re-authenticate. This is going to be from the query params. Okay, so we have handle card payment. Again, this is going to be very similar to the handle card setup, where it's going to return a promise that is resolved with an object that either has an error property or a payment intent property. We're going to say, if the response had an error, and we'll log that out. Otherwise, we want to say payment successful. Okay. Handling card payment. All right. Fun, we'll log that out. Okay, so at this point, we are ready to go. Now we just need a URL that has a payment intent ID and a payment method ID in the query params. So we're grabbing reference to the card error, the card button, pulling the payment intent ID and method ID out of the query params. We're fetching that payment intent so that we can show the error for the payment intent to the user. And then we are adding a click handler so that when the user clicks the button, we can pass the payment intent's client secret and the payment method that, that we attempted but failed earlier. So we're passing these two things so that the user can now walk through that authentication flow. And if they successfully go through that flow, then we'll have successful payment. Otherwise, they'll see some error, likely with regard to if they failed to enter their authentication details correctly. So we're at a point where we can attempt to try this, but to make this a little easier, one thing I want to do is go back to step 2 and log out a URL. So this, I forgot this step. We'll go back and do this. So in step 2, when we if we have this error, remember we have, okay, so we had it to do. All right, so let's go do this to do. I know oftentimes we add to-dos in code and then never go back and do them, but we're actually doing it today. So I think that's positive. If the error code is authentication required, is a special error code. If the error code when we attempt to charge this payment method off session is authentication required, then what we want to do is email customer with this link. Okay. How you pull them back on session is actually up to you. You could send a push notification or send them a text or send them an email. What we're going to do is send them a link with this URL. It's going to be at complete PI is going to be the response.error.payment intent ID. So that error is going to have a reference to the payment intent and the payment method. Okay. All right. And this is going to be the payment method value that we entered. Okay. All right. So I think that should work. All right. Before we go too much further, I just wanted to show you some of the test cards so we can walk through this whole process. So over here under saving cards, again, without payment, if you go to the very bottom of the screen, there is a test integration section that has cards that are specific to this SCA regulatory test cards. All right, so this is the 3155, the 3184. There are more test cards here. If you open up the Stripe docs and go under payments, if you go down to testing, there's a huge list of different test cards. One thing that most folks don't realize yet is that you can actually use the tokens directly. So if you're writing some automated tests and you don't want to enter the test card number directly, you can just use this toke visa as the result of like a successful tokenization. Same with payment methods. Again, there's tons of different international test cards for different reasons to simulate different situations. So today, again, we're going to be using the test cards from the testing your integration for SCA because these cards are specific to pushing through the SCA flow. Okay. Let's see. Just quickly checking the comments here. Right. So one of the questions here from Garrett was if we're charging something up front and then collecting a monthly variable amount after, am I correct and we need to set up intents API or can I just stick with payment intents? So if you are collecting payment up front, you can use a payment intent directly and use setup future usage. There is a benefit to charging the same amount every month. There's a special exemption for that we help you with if you're using Stripe billing. But if you're kind of like collecting different amounts every month, then you can use a payment intent with setup future usage off session in the beginning. If you are not collecting payment up front, you want to use setup intent so that later down the road you can charge those variable amounts. Okay, cool. Jumping back over to the example here, refreshing this. Okay, so the card number, the first one we're going to try is we want to walk through the process and just watch the 4242 card so I can show you kind of like what this looks like. And we can test it. So we're going to save that card, handling card setup. We've got our payment method. Coming back over here, refreshing, adding our payment method and customer to our admin that we're going to use to charge later. Clicking charge the customer, creates a payment intent, and the customer was charged. Okay, so that works successfully. Again, we want to try this card that will always require authentication. So the 3184 card. Attempt to save the card. We're going to use this card because this will help push us through to this last step where we need to bring the customer back on session. So we're copying this payment method, pasting it in here, copying the customer, kind of switching back and forth a little bit. So now this customer, again, this payment method was using the 84, what is the card? 3184 card. And now we logged out that we want to email the customer with this link. Again, you can construct this however you want. You need to bring the customer back on session somehow. And so we are constructing a link here that has the payment intent and the payment method embedded in the URL params. That's because we don't have a database for the demo. You might instead pass like a link that has some token that refers to your order internally. So for now, we're just going to copy that link and paste it into the URL. And when we refresh, the first thing we're going to do is fetch the payment intent. And it looks like we got a 500 back. That's great. Okay, so fetching the payment intent failed. That's because we're not passing it any IDs of what payment intent to fetch. So let's go add that quickly. Step 3, fetch the payment intent. And we're going to pass the ID being payment intent ID. Okay, so we just updated it so that we're passing in the ID of the payment intent. Back to the browser, refreshing. And payment intent ID is not defined. Oh, it's because I misspelled it. All right. Great. Back to the browser, refresh. Okay, so now we have fetched the payment intent and we added the inner text for this card error to show the error for that payment intent, which is again on this last payment error property of the payment intent object. So your card was declined. This transaction requires authentication. So the user came back on session. We sent them this link. They came back on session. They click Authenticate. We're going into handle card payment and Stripe is not defined. Great. Okay. So we need to go define Stripe. All right. And steal that from the other page here. Okay, so we're just initializing that Stripe object that we're using down here for handle Stripe card payment, Stripe handle card payment. So I hadn't initialized this yet, and so I got this error that says Stripe is not defined. Okay, refresh the page again. All right, now authenticate. The user has come back on session to walk through and complete their authentication. And now payment was successful. So again, today, we went through this whole flow of collecting and saving card details, which may require authentication up front. We're using the setup intent to go through and handle that authentication. We're getting permission from the customer to charge them later. Then we showed in the admin view how to charge that card or the customer later. You create this off-session payment intent, which again, the payment intent is going to move money. So we're creating this off-session payment intent, confirming it, passing in the payment method that's been authenticated and the customer that we stored that payment method on. And finally, we're bringing the customer back on session in the off chance that off session payment required authentication. So this has been, quite a beast of a walkthrough. I really appreciate your time and thank you for joining us. We're going to hang out for a little while longer here in chat to answer some more questions. But yeah, that kind of wraps up the code demo. So I really hope you enjoyed that. Okay, so let's see. Yeah, we are reusing cards. This is the kind of the guide that we went through today. I also want to note that we have an overview for Checkout. Checkout is another Stripe product that you might be interested in that is SCA ready. And specifically, I wanted to mention that there is a new type of checkout called setup mode checkout, which is a checkout offering where you don't actually need to collect money. You can use it just for collecting card details or updating card details. So that's one of the things that I wanted to point out. Also, we have this migration guide for billing. Billing is going to be the next episode we plan on doing in this Developer Office Hours series on going through these SCA migration guides. Cool. Okay, let's see. Just quickly checking the comments here. Again, really appreciate you guys joining us. If you have questions later, feel free to hit us up on IRC. We're in Freenode, the Stripe, the Pound Stripe channel on Freenode. Also, again, really, if you subscribe to this channel, we'll be doing other live demos, helping you walk through and build your integration. Check out the docs. If you have questions that are regarding your account directly, you might be interested in reaching out to support.stripe.com. Tons and tons of really helpful folks over there. Other things to mention, we plan on having, these Stripe demos in other languages down the line. So we'll have, Ruby, Python, Node, etc. We started with PHP because we know lots of folks are using PHP these days, but we're really excited to build in a few different languages. So again, the code for this demo will be up on the Stripe samples GitHub organization under the Developer Hours repo. So feel free to check that out. There's also a ton of really great Stripe samples for other payment flows. So if you're interested in checking out, how to collect taxes or a few different payment flows, and generally each of those demos that are in the Stripe samples repo will kind of follow the same pattern and the same directory structure. And the others will have examples in other languages. So if you look in the server directory in those other Stripe samples, you'll see examples in Ruby and Golang and .NET, etc. Cool. Awesome. Yeah, again, if you're looking for links to things, we'll drop those in the show notes. So come back, check out the show notes if you're interested. Again, we're going to be hanging out online here, answering your questions. Sophie, again, thank you so much for joining us. Did you have anything else that you wanted to jump in and add?
I can go ahead and just do a quick overview of some of the SCA ready products we have.
Perfect. Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you.
Perfect. So just as a very quick recap, Stripe has sort of three main SCA ready product offerings. The first is the Payments API, which you saw in action today. That's sort of our most flexible solution if you want to be building a custom payments form. We also, as mentioned, have Stripe Checkout, which is the fastest way to get up and running. It's a hosted payment page that runs on payment intents under the hood. And then finally, we have Stripe Billing, which is for businesses that accept recurring payments. So it identifies which subscription charges require authentication, and it can even trigger an email to subscribers if authentication is needed. And so that'll actually be the topic of our next Developer Office Hours. We'll go through a Stripe Billing integration.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Thanks again, Sophie, for joining us. It's always great to have tons of really knowledgeable folks here to help out and answer questions. I see that it looks like folks are in chat here on YouTube are getting their questions answered pretty well. Again, if you have follow-up questions that happen after this series, reach out on IRC, and we will we'll be happy to help you out. Okay, we hang out in there most of the time. So we've got folks around the world that are in there to answer questions and help you get your integration built. Okay, so yeah, I think we're gonna hang around and keep the stream on for a little while longer, but yeah, thanks again for joining us, and thanks again for watching.